Hello and welcome to the new lecture of Augustan poetry. So in Latin literature, Augustan poetry is a poetry that flourished during the reign of Caesar Augustus as Emperor of Rome, most notably including the works of Virgil, Horace and Ovid. And in English literature, Augustan poetry is a branch of Augustan literature and refers to the poetry of the 18th century, especially in the first half of the 18th century. Now, if we think about the Augustan poetry as primarily satirical in the theme and treatment of subject would be one-sided assertion. But in reality, there is a line of reflective poetry that runs from the late 17th century and which started by Nahum Tate. Okay, this kind of reflective poetry was started by Nahum Tate till Oliver Goldsmith and William Cooper. Now it is kind of the primary thrust of criticism that has been there in Augustan age, that it is one rooted in urbanity and social etiquettes were very much prevalent during Augustan time, and it ignored the equal longing for solitude that was found to be in the romantics themselves. However, for the Augustans, a retreat to the countryside meant replacing ambition with usefulness. Okay, so it is not like they are totally drawn towards nature, so when they want rest to in a race of ambition, so they used to retreat to nature. So there was a poet named as Thomas Parnell, who was a dear friend of Alexander Pope and Jonathan Swift, and they are considered the example of reflective poetry observed in the Hermit, that is one of the fully equipped for his vocation. Okay, so these were some of the poets that started writing in that point of time. Now, the Augustan reflective poetry does not attempt to shock them by presenting a deep individualistic view of it basically life. Rather, it points out to the reader what is common between the poet and the reader, and it deliberately ignored the separatists of the poet and the reader. Okay, so that they not only valued their own efforts and composing poetry, but also Greek and Latin roots from which it was derived. So Augustans basically were the writers who looked at the classical writers once again. So they were bringing the novelty, but they have been not forgetting the roots of Greek and Latin poetry, and such kind of relationship has been established in the Augustan period, which actually brought the present and past together and thus create a sense of timelessness. Okay, so favorite among them, the poets of the classical age, was Horace. Okay, because he was a poet of general themes. Now his odes written in non-political subjects dealt with general themes such as the pleasure of friendship, of rural solitude, the folly of ambition, and the, you can say that the impermanence of human happiness. The women writers were discouraged from print publication, but it was in the 18th century which actually emerged, seen the witness of the emergence of many women writers. And who were these women writers? Basically, they were Afra Ben, Anne Killingrue, Margaret Cavendish. So these were some of the writers. Okay, then you can say that they were Hannah More. These are some women writers who started writing during this period of time, and before this period they were not allowed to write something. Okay, so who claimed their, basically these were the writers who claimed their presence in the literary sphere as well as the public sphere. Now, what were the some major literary figures of 18th century? So the 18th century was also the time of kind of satirical verses. Lot of satires were written at that point of time, and the major poets were Samuel Butler, John Dryden, Alexander Pope, Samuel Johnson, and there were one Irish poet as well, that is Jonathan Swift. So we will read about them one by one. Now these poets constituted the neoclassical age, which comprised of three parts. So this is one umbrella term is neoclassical age. Okay, what is the umbrella term? Neoclassical age. Under these three periods come, and what are these periods? First is the Restoration period. Next is the Augustan period that we are studying right now, and the next is Age of Johnson. These were three periods that together known as the neoclassical period. Now satires during this period aim to point out the shortcoming of society through ridiculing accepted standards of thought. Okay, so satires were very much prominent at this point of time, and now it basically through satires writers expose Britain's flaw, okay, chastising the hypocrisy of the time. They also translated, imitated Greek and Latin words. Okay, they were intended to produce more rationalized, elegant words. And Samuel Johnson's Vanity of Human Wish is an imitation of Juvenal and Horace, was most famously imitated by other writers as well. Now, the first writer in this series is John Dryden. So, John Dryden was an English poet. He was a literary critic, translator, and a playwright who, in 1668, was appointed England's first poet laureate. Now, he is seen as dominating the literary life of Restoration England to such a point that the period came to be known by literary circles as the Age of Dryden. So, you can see that he was so much famous during this period. Now, Dryden is the greatest and most representative poet of this age. He is identified as the first poet laureate of England. Okay, so he was the first poet laureate. You can see the English first poet laureate who was appointed by Charles I in 1668. Now, his poetry has all the characteristic features of this particular age, which is famous for satirical vein, and could be witnessed in the poems like, you can say that, Absalom and Achitophel, Mac Flecknoe, Hind and Panther, Religio Laici, Annus Mirabilis. So these were some of the famous poems that were written by John Dryden. Now, he has also written some heroic stanza, and these were on the death of Oliver Cromwell, which made him known in the literary circles as well. So the best expression of Dryden literariness is found in Alexander Feast, which is one of the most popular ode. So first, let's talk about Absalom and Achitophel. Okay, Absalom and Achitophel. So this is basically the most important work of Dryden, and this is a kind of a satire which is actually disguised as a biblical allegory, and it was published anonymously in 1681, right? And it tells the story of Absalom rebels against King David. It was written in a kind of heroic couplets, and the allegorical poem represents the cases of King Charles II, the Popish plot, and the Monmouth rebellion. Now, the subtitle of the satire, okay, so it was there in the title page. The subtitle was a poem. What was the subtitle of John Dryden? A poem, right? Now, this satire was its majestic that Pope calls the most majestic march and energy divine. Okay, so it was basically such a good satire. Next, he has written the work, The Medal. Okay, now the Medal, Dryden attacks Shaftesbury in his satire, The Medal. Okay, whom he attacks, if the question comes whom he attacks in The Medal, it was Shaftesbury. Now, which